fire hose water would be able to extinguish them. That appears to have been the trigger for initiating the demolition sequence. One of the most striking features here is that the plane hit about the 80th floor on the South Tower, purportedly, and the top 30 floors of that 110-story building started to tilt to one side. Now, it's very curious as to how it should be tilting in the first place, because what's going on here is really quite complete, abrupt, and total. But what's fascinating about this is, as even Stephen Jones, the physicist from BYU, observed in his chapter published in David Ray Griffin and Peter Dale Scott's book, 9/11 in American Empire, as it starts to tilt, it doesn't collapse, fall all the way to the ground. Instead, it turns into dust, which he reports as being a phenomenon he to this day cannot explain. But here you see what's going on. I mean, this building is being pulverized, or in another language, dustified. It's not undergoing a pancake collapse of the kind the government asserts. Look at this. Those buildings are being converted into very fine dust. This, of course, being the South Tower, which is destroyed first. Here's the North. Witness this sequence. Would actually occurred in approximately the time that I just consumed to show you those images, 10 seconds. 10 seconds. These two buildings were demolished in approximately 10 seconds apiece, which is quite stunning if you consider that they were being demolished through their points of greatest resistance. Presumably every floor was, of course, designed to support every floor above it. John Skilling, who was one of the chief engineers who designed the building, reported that the building had the capacity to carry 20 times its live load, which would be the dead load of the building itself above, plus all the personnel, furniture that ever might be expected to occupy it. And now a physics and math instructor by the name of Charles Baldwin has calculated that, as a matter of fact, the carrying capacity of these buildings was vastly greater than Skilling had observed. Now, this is a drawing from Judy Wood, who is a former professor of mechanical engineering at Clemson, describing what it would look like if a pancake collapse had occurred. Suppose those trusses, for example, had collapsed one upon another, all the way down to the ground. Well, then you'd have, in the end, a stack of those trusses, right? And what about the core columns? What about those 47 massive core columns? Would they just go poof? Here's an actual pancake collapse from Pakistan. Notice you have a stack of floors. Human beings and other living things are sandwiched in between these. It's quite a catastrophe, but look at the mass of rubble. Now, in the case of the Twin Towers, remarkably, the buildings were destroyed below ground level. That's fairly astonishing. Here's another diagram Judy has provided. She has compared these artificial man-made structures with living things and offered the metaphor that they were two gigantic trees that were turning to sawdust from the top down. And when it was done, they had been virtually completely converted into very fine dust. Here's a study by Charles Baldwin in which he calculated that if you took the top 16 floors in the North Tower, for example, as having 1 unit of force down, so you got the bottom 94 floors, which turn out to have the equivalent of 588 force units up, that would require the equivalent of 588 of those 16 floor segments, given that the plane in the North Tower hit about the 94th floor. Or alternatively, that if you were to drop that top 16 floors down onto the remaining 94, in order to attain enough kinetic energy to bring about the effect of a collapse, you would have to take those 16 floors 120 miles out into space. And even then it wouldn't attain sufficient velocity because the influence of air would create a terminal velocity. Here you can see much of what I mean when I say those buildings were reduced below ground level. I had Father Frank Morales, a first responder and Episcopal priest from a nearby church, come on my radio show, and twice we discussed it, and he explained how the buildings were actually destroyed below ground level. Now that's quite extraordinary. because we have a lot of experience with demolition of buildings, and as it typically occurs, there's a residue from the destruction of a convention center or a stadium or a building equivalent to approximately 12% of the height of the building. Well, 12% of the height of a 110-story building would be, 10% would be 11 floors, 0.2 more, a couple more, so we should have had 13 or 14 floors remaining if this were what is known as a conventional demolition, but we don't. Look at this, 10 seconds, over 10-second period of time, as even the 9/11 Commission itself acknowledged. You go from this massive structure to a pile of dust in 10 seconds. I should observe, incidentally, as the 9/11 Commission report does not, that no steel structure high-rise had ever collapsed or been destroyed due to fires before 9/11, nor after 9/11, nor, if our research is correct, on 9/11. Now, Judy has also calculated that if you were to drop, say, a bowling ball off the top of a 110-story building, if it were in a vacuum, it would take 9.22 seconds to hit the ground. Well, just think about that. This is a bowling ball that's falling through only air. In fact, we're talking about a time calculated for a vacuum, so it's not even encountering air resistance, which means that these two massive buildings are supposed to have collapsed through their points of greatest resistance in approximately the same amount of time it would take a bowling ball to fall from the top of those buildings to the ground in a vacuum. It's very interesting that while we cannot conduct experiments with buildings that no longer exist in terms of their fire resistance, it happened that in 1975 there was an enormous fire on the 11th floor of the North Tower. It burned at an intense heat around 2,000 degrees for 3 hours. What's most important about this is after that fire had eventually been extinguished, they did not have to replace any of the steel. It was this fire, incidentally, that led to the introduction and the construction of the sprinkler system throughout the building, which, as I have suggested, had to be disabled in order for those fires to burn long enough to offer some plausible explanation for why the buildings had crashed. Here again now you see the North Tower being converted into very fine dust. No one, I should think, observing these photographs could imagine that what they're watching is a collapse of any kind. Here again, look at this. It's stunning. It is awful in more senses than one. But it most certainly is not the collapse of a 110-story building. It's some kind of pulverization or dustification whereby that building is being turned into very fine dust. And here, if indeed that's the case, it should not be surprising that in some footage at least we would see some parts of the building being turned to dust. This is a part of the core columns of the North Tower. You're actually watching a segment of the core column of the North Tower turning to dust. And look at the amount of dust. The quantity was enormous. We're talking about converting two 500,000-ton buildings into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust. Look at that. Remember, that dust didn't come from nowhere. That dust came from the conversion of those buildings, principally made of steel and concrete, into very, very fine particles, which eventually would blow out to sea. Sympathize with this poor guy and the task he confronts, the massiveness, the enormity of it all. And among the bizarre aspects of this is that whatever brought about this destruction, it was relatively harmless to paper. There was tens of thousands of tons of paper distributed all over the city. So this tends to undermine the hypothesis that what was going on here involved very high temperatures or intense fires, because so much